Welcome to Dove Biology, Apes Lessons to Go, Cultural Revolutions, and the Environment. Until about 12,000 years ago, humans were mostly nomadic hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons. They collected plants, hunted, and fished. Population growth was slow as a result of high infant mortality and a much shorter expected lifespan. Early hunter-gatherers had a very small impact on the environment. More advanced hunter-gatherers had an increased environmental impact as a result of use of increasing technologies, new tools, and the use of fire. There is significant anthropological evidence that indicates that early, more advanced hunter-gatherers actually altered the distribution of plants and animals. For example, our eastern Native Americans, like those that lived in the Shenandoah Valley, would actually burn the valley to make sure that it was maintained as grassland and would not return to forest in order to keep a habitat for the eastern bison that they relied on for resources. Western Native American populations, those that relied on buffalo, would alter the patterns of the bison migrations, and sometimes even have large buffalo kills. Despite these things that had large environmental impacts, because the resource use was low per person since the population was maintained at low numbers, the folks had to migrate in order to follow their resources, and overall a low amount of technology for consumption of the resources that were available gave time for the environment to repair itself. And so despite an increased environmental impact, we didn't see the large environmental degradation that we see today. Now, three major changes have occurred since humans were hunter-gatherers. These changes have increased our impact on the environment. They are the Agricultural Revolution, the Industrial Medical Revolution, and the Information-Globalization Revolution. The Agricultural Revolution occurred about 10 to 20,000 years ago when humans learned how to grow and breed plants and animals for food, clothing, and other purposes. Now, early agriculture had an increased impact on the earth when compared to our hunter-gatherer impact, but it was much less compared to modern agricultural techniques. Early agriculture probably resembles today's subsistence farming, where we have families that are mostly using human and maybe animal work to be able to cultivate plants for themselves and maybe a small population. Whereas our modern mechanized agriculture uses a high input of fuels and resources to be able to grow food for a growing population, and so it has a much greater impact. Now, approximately 275 years ago, the invention of large-scale mechanized production and the introduction of new medicines brought on what we would call the Industrial Medical Revolution. These new machines required us to shift from using timber, which is a renewable resource, to fossil fuels. And a growing population, as a result of new medicines, required us to grow lots and lots of food more efficiently. So people had a much higher standard of living as a result of the Industrial Medical Revolution, but it has led to a huge amount of environmental degradation. More population means more resource use. Mechanization has high demands of energy and a high requirement of resources to be able to produce the goods for this new consumer base. More recently, we've seen what we call the Information and Globalization Revolution. It started about 50 years ago and came with the development of technologies which allowed us to gather and access information on a global scale. Computers, satellites, etc. Now, with this information, we can actually respond to change in the environment quite rapidly. We're able to detect if there's changes that are occurring in a river valley, changes in timber cover. But with so much more information, it could actually lead to confusion and hopelessness as we get this kind of information overload and have a hard time making decisions and responding in a timely fashion. Each of our cultural revolutions has impacted the environment. It's allowed us to have more energy and new technologies that allow us to alter and control the planet so that we can meet our needs and our wants. But it's also allowed for us to expand our human population as a result of having more food. And now we also have much larger lifespans. Now, most of the population growth today is occurring in developing countries. And this is a result of cultural and economic differences. So this is where our struggle is. If we're going to try to reduce our human population growth, not only are we going to have to focus on maintaining low growth numbers in the developed world, we're also going to have to find ways to reduce population growth in these developing nations. There are a few strategies that we'll talk about as we proceed in our course of study. So how fast is the human population growing? Well, if we look at a graph of human population, we see that it's an example of exponential growth. Exponential growth occurs when we have a quantity that increases by a fixed percent of a whole in a given time, and we get what we call a J curve as a result of its shape. So, for example, we could save $1,000 per year with no interest. If we just putting $1,000 into the bank account for a year, in 70 years we'd have $70,000, which is a pretty good chunk of change. But if we put $1,000 into our bank account and allowed it to accrue interest at 10% per year, in that same amount of time, we'd have over $1 million, a much better yield. So when you have exponential growth, it usually starts off really slow, but after a few doublings, it grows to an enormous number. Now, many of you might be familiar with the formula for exponential growth from your math classes. This might be a useful formula for us as we move forward, but the expectation isn't that we're going to have to really know and use this formula very much. A more important tool, one which allows us to have kind of a quick way to calculate the time it takes for something to double when growing exponentially, is the rule of 70, a much more easy tool to use. The rule of 70 basically is 70 divided by the growth rate, and that will give us our doubling time in years. So if we look at our current world population growth rate of 1.14%, if we put that into our formula, it says that with our current population of 7 billion people, in order for it to double, it's going to take till about 2067. So what's going to happen to the Earth's resources and the wildlife as a result of this kind of exponential growth? Many environmental scientists and other analysts call for us to bring about a new sustainability revolution sometime during this century, so that despite growing populations, we can reduce our footprint and live more sustainably. What do you think about this? Do you think a revolution like this has already begun? If not, what is going to allow us to set a revolution like this in motion? As we continue our study of environmental science, consider this suggestion and let me know what you think.